Hi, I'm Jeanette Roche, and this is Bridge City News. Here are some of the top stories we've been following. 2 Israeli embassy staff members gunned down in Washington, D.C. in a targeted attack by a man yelling "Free Palestine." Plus, still waiting to hear from the union on its latest offer, Canada Post agrees to return to bargaining. And Prime Minister Mark Carney officially sworn in as MP and will take a seat in the House for the first time May 26th.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Jeanette Roche.
Thanks so much for joining us. The Canadian Union of Postal Workers says the latest offers from Canada Post fall short with only hours to go until a looming strike deadline. The union, representing about 55,000 Canada Post employees, says it's still reviewing the proposals, but it identified several areas where the offers disappoint. The union highlighted stagnated wages and cost of living adjustments. Canada Post says it's already started to see mail volumes decline ahead of the possible labor disruption. Prime Minister Mark Carney has officially been sworn in as MP for the first time. Carney swore allegiance to King Charles in a ceremony today on Parliament Hill, 3 weeks after voters elected him in the Ottawa riding of Nepean. Carney will take his seat in the House of Commons on Monday when Parliament returns. Then King Charles will read the throne speech in the Senate chamber on Tuesday. A 31-year-old man from Chicago has been charged with the shooting deaths of a young couple Wednesday night as they were leaving an event at a Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. The double murder has shocked the U.S. Capitol. Police say it was a targeted attack.
Prior to the shooting, the suspect was observed pacing back and forth outside of the museum. He approached a group of 4 people, produced a handgun, and opened fire, striking both of our decedents. After the shooting, the suspect then entered the museum and was detained by event security. Once in handcuffs, the suspect identified where he discarded the weapon, and that weapon has been recovered, and he implied that he committed the offense. The suspect chanted, "Free, free Palestine," while in custody.
This is the direct result of toxic, anti-Semitic incitement against Israel and Jews around the world that has been going on since the October 7th massacre. Recently, we have witnessed an unprecedented wave of terror attacks and attempts against Israeli missions around the world, with an emphasis on Europe.
The 2 people killed were identified as Israeli citizen Yaron Leshinsky and American Sarah Milgram. The Israeli ambassador to the United States says the young couple were about to be engaged. The gunman has been identified as Elias Rodriguez. Prime Minister Mark Carney says he's devastated and appalled by last night's targeted attack and says his prayers are with the victims and their loved ones. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says the couple was killed simply because they were Jewish. Israel's ambassador to Canada has met with senior officials from the Foreign Affairs Ministry after Israeli soldiers fired warning shots earlier this week in the West Bank near a diplomatic tour that included Canadians. Ido Mued says he won't discuss what happened in that closed-door meeting after being summoned. He would say only that Israel will be transparent as it investigates the incident. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand confirmed yesterday that 4 Canadians were part of a tour in Jenin when shots were fired. The Israeli military accused the group of leaving an approved route and said shots were fired into the air, quote, to distance them. Fortunately, no one was harmed. This, unfortunately, has not been the first time we've reported that 2025 hasn't been the greatest year for air travel, particularly on North American soil. Well, early Thursday morning, another incident happened. A small plane crashed into a San Diego military housing neighborhood, setting about 15 homes on fire, along with vehicles, and forcing the evacuation of about 100 people. Multiple people on board the private plane are dead, but no one on the ground was injured, according to authorities.
It was like a big bang, basically. And then We looked up and then we see a bunch of smoke and fire. So that's when we knew it was time to go. So.
This morning at approximately 3:45, 3:47, we have reports of a plane down in the Murphy Canyon neighborhood. San Diego Fire quickly coordinated a response for a plane down incident, and our units responded and started to investigate.
We had officers from throughout the city that responded. We had over 50 officers that were able to get here within minutes. We started evacuating all of the homes that were impacted. We had an evacuation center up at Miller Elementary. We have close to 100 people that have been displaced and are up there.
Finance ministers from the G7 have emerged from their summit in Banff, Alberta, with a joint communique. The governor of the Bank of Canada says the ministers agreed on and worked on 4 key areas of leadership.
Reducing policy uncertainty, addressing unsustainable global imbalances, improving the dialogue around tariffs and fixing the problems in the global trading system, and implementing policies to boost productivity and growth. Today, we also had important discussions on fostering the adoption of AI, equipping workers in our countries, and harnessing the productivity gains from AI. Over the last 2 days, we also discussed reducing risks in our financial system, and we agreed on improving data collection and sharing of information on non-bank financial institutions. I want to particularly highlight the tone of the discussions was particularly constructive. Maybe we were helped by the breathtaking views of the Canadian Rockies and the wonderful fresh mountain air, but whatever it was, there was a real spirit of constructive engagement, a spirit of working together to the benefit of our citizens.
The meeting this week in Banff precedes the G7 Leaders Summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, coming up in June. Well, if you've been driving around Lethbridge, then you've likely noticed the 2 new speed reduction measures implemented by the city. 9 traffic calming curbs and 20 digital speed indicators have already been installed at different locations. Ahmed Ali, transportation engineering manager for the city of Lethbridge, says speeding is a primary and secondary cause of collisions, and 50% of collisions occurred at intersections.
So as you see in my background, these are called temporary traffic calming curbs, and they have been used in Alberta, in Canada, in many locations. There are many advantages other than just reducing the speed. You know, reduction of speed itself helps so much in road safety. The other initiative we have is speed feedback sign, and that tells you what's your speed. So instantaneously, drivers are reminded that they are going over the speed limit, and that has a psychological, effect on people, and then they slow down. And both are evidence-based. So all the solutions we are using in the city are evidence-based. By implementing more and more recommendations from the Transportation Safety Plan, we are able to achieve our Vision Zero. And again, to remind, what is Vision Zero for City of Lethbridge is achieving 0 fatalities and injuries, major injuries primarily, from the road collisions in 2040.
Ali says the benefits of traffic calming curbs include shortened pedestrian crossing distances, improved driver yielding and stopping compliance, and better visibility at intersections. I personally love the little happy faces there. Well, the Lethbridge Housing Authority, the Blood Tribe Department of Health, and the City of Lethbridge are celebrating the opening of the new Wellness Center and Shelter expansion on Thursday. The new and improved shelter will be able to accommodate 200 beds, more than double the previous capacity for people in need of safe housing or in need of recovery. It's made to be more accessible with those with physical and mobility challenges and comes with a security nest to supervise activity down below. Those who have partnered with the project say the expansion was a long time coming.
We know wintertime, inclement weather, we're challenged at times. How do we continue to support members when we are seeing kind of the crowdedness? Well, this is just alleviating some of that and further accommodating the guests here at the shelter.
This will provide a safe space, and it will also allow us to keep the stabilization beds open year-round because we won't have to worry about expanded winter space because we'll have it here. So it will make a great impact, and it will allow people to continue their healing journey through the winter time. It's going to take all of us to make this happen, so I'm very grateful that we are here showing our support for each other as organizations and for our partners, the Blood Tribe Department of Health. I think that together we can make a large impact in our community, and I'm just really pleased that they've all come to support us.
Before the expansion, the shelter could accommodate 91 individuals, but saw over 250 people sheltering during the winter. Following the province's announcement Wednesday on the expedited construction of various new school projects across Alberta, the Palliser School Division says they are excited that the town of Colehurst will see a modernization of their existing high school. The school, built in 1957, will now move forward to the design phase of the project. Superintendent Dave Driscoll says they're greatly appreciative of the province investing in education in rural zones.
It's a project that we've been working on for numerous years, trying to move forward on. It's Colehurst is a community that continues to grow, and we're getting a little tight on space in our schools. Over the last few years, we've gone into the planning phase where we did a lot of work with our community in deciding what to build and how and what it would look like. And we're excited that through the accelerated program that we're moving forward into the design phase. Hopefully into the construction phase sooner than later. This government is still investing heavily in our rural areas, and they have faith that these areas need modern schools just like everyone else. Our school that we have is a great school. Staff are amazing. Kids are getting great education. But when we can expand that with a newer facility that offers opportunities beyond what they can have in their existing building, it will enhance their ability to be successful in anything they choose to do in the future. So we're looking forward to that, and we're gratefully appreciating the work that Alberta Ed and Infrastructure is doing.
Tourism Lethbridge is recognizing the important role of frontline workers. They were celebrated at a party Wednesday at the Southern Alberta Ethnic Association. Tourism Lethbridge CEO Aaron Crane says the event recognizes the important role of hotel employees, servers, retail, and other staff who play in delivering exceptional visitor experiences.
And they're the ones who really make the difference. When you make an impact in a visitor's life, that's when they go home and they tell more people about the experience that they had in Lethbridge. That's when they decide, oh, hey, we're going to stay a little bit longer and we're going to spend more money and we're going to go to the place that you recommended. Today, we are also launching the Explore Lethbridge app. It is only right now for those frontline employees. If they go and they show the app at the attractions around town, they will get in for free so that they can see firsthand what those attractions are all about.
When we're celebrating them, we're saying you're important, because if the frontline workers are giving a really good impression, that often will be enough for someone to want to come back. And I think a lot of times they're unheralded in the kind of work that they do, because people think, oh, they're just, frontline, they're just working. But they're really not, because they are definitely ambassadors for our city and our whole region.
Oh, because they're the first interaction that many people have with Lethbridge. And they set that first impression. And Lethbridge is fun, friendly, and inviting. And we have such a great diversity of cultures that live in Lethbridge. 100 different languages are spoken. And we have young people, we have old people, we have people all ages working in those jobs.
According to the most recent study from Stats Canada, federal, provincial, and territorial governments collected 93.7% of the government revenue generated by tourism in 2023. One of the hottest new fitness fads amongst seniors is chair yoga. And while sitting down to exercise may not sound like a workout, devotees see a world of benefits. New York City yoga instructor Whitney Chapman points to things like improved flexibility, strength and balance, and overall emotional well-being.
You're stretching your whole body. You're getting all the joints at one point or another. And also, what you can do in a chair is that it's a little bit more forgiving on the knees and on the hips. So as you age, it allows you to get into positions that you were doing standing with the use of the chair, and then being able to really do the pose without hurting yourself.
I took it up because I have osteoporosis, And the chair yoga is much easier. You don't have to worry as much about falling and breaking anything. It is not as difficult as I thought it would be, but it's not easy. And you really do use your muscles. It's an excellent workout.
And then a little change of hands. Curl your middle fingers in. I love you too. The very first time in a yoga class, I brought in the chair. All of my students said, I don't want geriatric yoga. I'm not an old person. And then they saw that just having a chair, it's another prop that's going to help you do what you want to do. So it's not necessarily because you're older, but it can be helpful. And it doesn't mean you're geriatric just because you're sitting in a chair. In the front and back.
Start. And if you want to start where you can really feel like you're confident and in control, start in a chair. Get into a chair and do some yoga.
A small study published in the April 2023 edition of the journal Healthcare found chair yoga to be an effective intervention for women 65 years and older with knee osteoarthritis and could help lessen the risk of osteoarthritis progressing to a disability. Good to know. Well, it seems all week we've been forecasting a risk of thunderstorm, and Friday's forecast not much different, but just wait till you see what's in store for us next week. I'll be right back with your full weather report. Well, we have been anticipating thunderstorms all week long, and that forecast is going to last right into Friday, along with a 30% chance of showers. But temperature-wise, coming in a little bit higher than average for this time of year at that 20 degrees. And then after that, we're getting into a lovely weekend. So Saturday and Sunday, temperatures back in the 20s there, so high 23 on Saturday, 26 degrees on Sunday with beautiful, clear, sunny skies, 28 on Monday. And then look what happens. By Tuesday and Wednesday, we are in the 30-degree range there, so 30 on Tuesday, 32 on Wednesday. Now, if we do reach that 32-degree mark on Wednesday, we could actually break a record set back in 1986, which was 31.5 degrees on that day, which was, I think, May 28th. So average high for this time of year, 20 degrees, average low, 6 degrees. 31 was the record high on this day, happening back in 1928 and in 1960. -4 was the record low. So daytime, we're looking at the hours here. So 5:38 is when the sun rose this morning, sunset this evening at 9:19. Oh yeah, it's a long day. We're looking at 15 hours, 41 minutes of daylight, almost 16 hours. We are just getting so close to that summer solstice now. I'm loving this time of year. It makes it hard to go to sleep at night, though, very early. Okay, on the west coast tomorrow, a pair of 17s for both Victoria and Vancouver. Partly cloudy skies. We're seeing more cloudy periods in the morning and then clearing up by the afternoon in Vancouver. Both Edmonton and Calgary seeing sunshine in the morning, 30% chance of showers by the afternoon, risk of a thunderstorm as well. 19 Edmonton and high of 18 degrees tomorrow in Calgary is what we're looking at. Looking to the rest of the prairies, we are seeing mainly just sort of scattered clouds, partly cloudy skies in Saskatoon, high of 20, 19 for the high in Regina under clear skies, and beautiful sunshine expected tomorrow in Winnipeg with a high of 20 degrees there. Okay, so we're seeing a lot more rain as we get further east. So Toronto looking at 10 to 20 millimeters of rain there, 12 for the high, only 11 the expected high tomorrow in Ottawa with 40% chance of showers, periods of rain expected tomorrow in Montreal, high of 12 degrees there as well. Looking to the Maritimes, Fredericton seeing a lot of rain, 10 to 20 millimeters expected there, high of only 8 degrees. Halifax seeing a 20 to 30 millimeters of rain, could see a possibility of a thunderstorm there, high of 11 degrees. Charlottetown also 10 to 20 millimeters of rain. By the way, Halifax also up to 70K winds, up to 60K winds in Charlottetown, high of 7 degrees. And a mix of sun and cloud tomorrow in St. John's with fog dissipating in the morning, high of only 6 degrees. So there you have it. That is your forecast. Automaker Stellantis says it's postponing production of the Dodge Charger Daytona RT at its assembly plant in Windsor, Ontario for the 2026 model year. The company says the change comes as it continues to assess the effects of U.S. tariff policies, but it's continuing to produce other versions of the popular Dodge Charger muscle car. Stellantis says the change in production will not affect employment at the Windsor facility. Work was halted at the auto assembly plant in Windsor for a week earlier this month after production was shuttered for 2 weeks when U.S. President Donald Trump first imposed the tariffs back in early April. Head of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, Flavio Volpe, is calling for an exploration into the potential of a new Canadian-born automaker.
Look, we've been making cars for 120 years, together with other partners. We make the argument that we have the best ecosystem, the best tool makers, the raw materials, suppliers, people, innovation ecosystem, and a posture. Those arguments, I've propagated them, I've defended them. But it's time to think in a time where Donald Trump has caused us to really defend the idea of, what is Canada? Other countries in the world respond with, well, what is Japan? Well, it's Toyota. And Germany responds with Mercedes, Volkswagen. We need to respond with a real look at whether we can sustain a Canadian automaker so that we create a nexus for applied technologies in manufacturing, AI, advanced autonomous connected drive, Internet of Things, and as well, real traditional making of things that people use, that they consider themselves tied to that identity.
TD Bank Group says 2% of its workforce will be cut as it aims to save around $600 million a year. The bank announced the reduction while reporting a second quarter profit of $11.1 billion. The cuts will amount to around 2,000 employees being let go. The restructuring comes as Chief Executive Raymond Chun looks for savings as the bank works to move past its costly anti-money laundering oversight scandal. Now here's a look at today's markets.
The TSX was up 14 points on the day to finish at 25,854. The Dow is down 1 point to 41,859. The S&P 500 was down 2 points to 5,842, and the Nasdaq was up 53 to 18,925. West Texas Intermediate oil was down 75 cents to $60.82 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 8 cents to $3.29 US. Gold was down 25.43 to $32.94.76 US an ounce, and silver was down 40 cents to $33.04 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $8.79 per bushel, barley is at $6.86, canola is at $16.21, and corn is at $7.95 per bushel. Live cattle were up 147 to 215.62 for the June contract. Feeder cattle were down 90 cents to 295.40, and lean hogs June contract was down 82 cents to 98.70. And the Canadian dollar was even over the past 24 hours and currently sits at 72.20 US.
Recapping one of our top stories, it's down to the wire for Canada Post and the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. While the post office has agreed to return to bargaining with the help of a mediator, the union is still reviewing the latest offer. About 55,000 union members are set to go on strike shortly after midnight. Equalization is a touchy subject for most Albertans, especially when numbers come out showing Quebec receives 66 cents for every equalization dollar. This year, that will be $13.6 billion. Many Albertans don't think that's fair and wonder if the equalization formula can be changed. Ted Morton, former Alberta Conservative Cabinet Minister and Vice President of Fairness Alberta, gives us his thoughts. That is all coming up next. Also, when you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. You can also visit our website or YouTube channel anytime to check out more of our stories and interviews.
We often hear debate about Canada's equalization payments program. There are have and have not provinces. Much of those payments come from Alberta and get redistributed to other provinces such as Quebec. Is this fair? Does something need to change? Our guest today is Dr. Ted Morton. He is a former Alberta Conservative Cabinet Minister and one of the co-authors of the famous Alberta Firewall Letter. He's also the Vice President of Fairness Alberta. Ted, it's great to have you with us.
Good to be with you today, Naveen.
So let's start with the issue of equalization payments. Although there are many other issues that we need to touch on as well, the equalization program is complicated. So can you briefly explain how equalization works in Canada and how much money Albertans are paying to other provinces annually in equalization payments, and what's the grand total over the years?
To answer that question would take our entire 15 minutes. There's no brief explanation, but very briefly, there's a concept called fiscal capacity, the ability of each of the 10 provinces, their ability to raise revenues. And Alberta ranks high on that. And so the higher your rank, the more you pay in. The lower your fiscal capacity, the more you get. Equalization program in Canada is about a $20 million a year program. Alberta, what Alberta pays into equalization is only about $3 billion a year. We pay another $3 billion a year in other types of direct payments, what's called the Canada Health Transfer, the Canada Social Transfer. Those are payments that go directly from Ottawa to provincial governments. And so that you're looking at around $6 billion a year. But that's only a small portion of the overall net loss of revenues out of Alberta to Ottawa. Those are payments that go to Ottawa and then directly to other provincial governments. There's also money that leaves Alberta that doesn't come back, that's not to governments, but just individuals. The Canada Pension Plan, employment insurance, we contribute much, much more into those than we get back because we have a younger workforce, fewer people we're taking pensions, more people paying in. Same thing on employment insurance. We've historically had lower employment. So when you add it all together, the equalization program, it's a $20 billion a year program. Alberta only puts in about $3 billion net because we don't get anything from it because our fiscal capacity is high. But that's only a fraction of the $15 to $20 billion a year that has been net leaving Alberta over the last 2 decades.
Okay, so 15 to 20 billion, that's a crazy amount of money. So one complaint might be, why should Alberta subsidize other provinces like Ontario and Quebec? Are we simply rewarding poor fiscal management and high spending?
In part, that's part of the equalization program. The government works better when the people making decisions are directly accountable to the people who are paying the taxes. And what's happening here with equalization and these other transfer programs is the money is leaving Alberta to go to Ottawa and then either being spent by Ottawa, not coming back to Albertans that pay in Canada Pension Plan, employment insurance, or going directly to other provinces. And just to give you, I think what has been aggravating, to say the least, to many Albertans on the equalization program alone, it's about a $20 billion a year program. Over the past 2 decades, Quebec has regularly received 66 cents of every equalization dollar. 2/3 of that $20 billion a year goes to Quebec. And we can get into why that happens if you want, but I think that's been very aggravating to Albertans, and particularly the things have been better for the last couple of years, but the decade from 2010 to 2020 were tough years for Alberta economically. We were debt free. We worked hard Ralph Klein had paid off the debt. The Stelmach government, we didn't do I was part of the government I was part of. We didn't do as good a job as we should have in terms of fiscal management. We didn't run up any new debt. In the next decade, there was close to $80 or $90 billion of debt in Alberta because of the decline in the economy. But Alberta was still paying $15 to $20 billion a year net to Ottawa for equalization and these other programs while we're running up $80 or $90 billion worth of debt. So that doesn't strike people as fair. When we're in recession and running up debt, why are we sending money to directly to other provincial governments.
Let's talk on Quebec for a bit there, because you were saying that that Quebec gets a higher amount of equalization payments, and it has something to do with language.
66 cents out of every dollar.
Right, and you were saying it had something to do with Quebec's language laws. Let's hear about that.
Well, again, this is kind of a baby boom. The Separatist Party became strong in Quebec in the late 70s and has been there. The separatist threat has been there since the late 70s. Pierre Trudeau's highest priority, the Liberal Party's highest priority, was to prevent Quebec separatism. And I think that has continued to be the highest priority of the Liberal Party of Canada for the last, well, in my adult lifetime, from the 1980s right up till now. And basically, keeping Quebec happy has been a priority for the Liberal Party. Partly, you could say, for patriotic reasons, but also it's how the Liberal Party wins elections. Take the election we just had. How many votes did the Liberal Party get in Alberta and Saskatchewan? How many MPs were elected in Alberta and Saskatchewan? I think 4. 4 out of 50. But between the two, Ontario and Quebec by themselves have 200 MPs. For a majority, you need 172 MPs. So Ontario and Quebec by themselves can elect majority governments. And I think 2/3 of the new prime minister's government, he's at 170 MPs. He's just shy of that 172 majority. But 2/3 of his MPs are from Ontario and Quebec. So talking about equalization and fiscal transfer is just kind of the micro issue, actually tracing dollars and cents, leaving Alberta and going elsewhere. But at a macro level, sort of in a broader sense, Alberta is constitutionally very vulnerable to a political strategy which says for the federal government, and mainly the Liberal Party, if we move money from resource-rich but voter-poor Western Canada to resource-poor but voter-rich Ontario, we can win elections.
So what would you like to see changed in the equalization formula?
That's technical. To take a few highlights, right now, the so-called fiscal capacity formulas, they look at the GDP of each province, right? But it doesn't look at the cost of delivering healthcare in any province. Well, the cost of delivering healthcare in Toronto, in Alberta, BC, and Ontario is much higher than it is in Quebec or Atlantic Canada, because housing is much more expensive in the provinces I just mentioned. In the pay-in provinces, salaries are lower. So there should be not just how much they're spending, but what it costs to deliver health, not just fiscal capacity. There are other examples. Non-renewable natural resources, in other words, oil and gas, are counted as part of fiscal capacity. So one of the reasons Alberta gets leaned on so heavily, or to be more blunt, gets drained so heavily, $15 to $20 billion a year, because that includes government of Alberta revenues from oil and gas royalties and other income from oil and gas, non-renewable resources. So, but on the other hand, in Quebec, Quebec has a big hydroelectric operation, which generates lots of money for the Quebec government. That's not included in fiscal capacity. So why is our non-renewable resources, in a certain sense, shouldn't be considered in fiscal capacity? Because once a barrel of oil comes out of the ground and Alberta is sold, that is a commodity. That is an asset we have that we no longer have, right? It's gone forever. Once a barrel of oil is taken out of the ground in Alberta and sold, Albertans have lost that royalty. Hydroelectric power is renewable. It goes year after year. So things like that Western Canadian oil and gas is included in fiscal capacity. but provincially owned. In the case of Quebec, their hydro operation is not included, leads to these imbalances. So that would be an example of couple of examples of what's wrong with the equalization formula and what could be reformed.
Yeah, and while we're on the topic of oil and gas, because there's also other issues, including federal policies that target Alberta disproportionately. So why are there offshore oil tanker restrictions on the West Coast that do not exist on the East Coast or the St. Lawrence Seaway? How does that make sense?
I'm afraid it doesn't make any sense at all, because, as you said, that the ban on oil and gas tankers on off the BC coast is one of the Trudeau initiatives that chased tens of billions of dollars of investment out of Alberta, out of Western Canada, in the 10 years that Trudeau was there. But tankers come down the Gulf, down the St. Lawrence River, Quebec City, Montreal at the same time. So again, it's a double standard. Quebec, there are lots of refineries in Quebec, employs lots of people, creates jobs, income, and so forth. So again, it's another double standard that goes back to the what I would call the federal framework, particularly the Liberal Party's framework of going to great lengths to appease Quebec, not to upset Quebec, and at the same time being able to take the double standard, because they don't pay a price for it in the West, because there's so few. They don't need to elect any MPs out of Alberta and Saskatchewan to get their majority governments in Ottawa.
Now, you're not necessarily for separation or anything like that, and even though there are like more calls for it. Separation aside, are there any particular steps Alberta can take just to leverage a better deal with the federal government?
What I'm about to say, I don't like to say, but I think it's the case, and that's what I wrote in the book, that the strategies that my generation used, the baby boom generation, the Klein government, and the other, both conservative and NDP governments since the 1980s, they haven't worked. We're worse off. We're more vulnerable today to predatory, destructive federal policies than we were in the 1980s. The gains that we'd made in the early 80s, early 90s have been wiped out and evaporated. So this, I think, will make sense to your viewers, that the people who benefit from this, which is the Liberal Party and Quebec, the people who the beneficiaries of the status quo don't voluntarily give up their advantages. So to get change is going to require a push. And I think push is what Jason Kenney started when he was premier, and with his Fair Deal Committee and the recommendations they made, his referendum on abolishing equalization, that was Kenney beginning the push. And now Danielle Smith has continued the push to change. And she's been very clear, in addition to demanding the changes in all the anti-oil and gas, anti-energy policies of the Trudeau era, she's also moving forward, to go back to how you introduced me, as one of the writers of the firewall back in the firewall letter back in 2000, some of the recommendations we made there, our own provincial police force, like Ontario and Quebec, collecting our own taxes, provincial taxes, like Quebec already does, having our own pension plan, pulling out of the Canada Pension Plan. Quebec, each province is entitled to its own pension plan. Quebec doesn't. That's the push, and I think that's what Danielle Smith is started, and so she struck this next committee. I believe they're going to be out holding town halls all next summer, listening to Albertans, and then coming back with new recommendations, and of course waiting to see what the new prime minister does. The new prime minister has a long history of being a lot greener than Justin Trudeau. Those were the policies that have harmed Alberta, Saskatchewan economically in the past decade. So there's also kind of been a trial marriage between the Prime Minister and the premiers of Saskatchewan to see what happens in the next 4 to 5 months. So it's going to be a very interesting summer and fall.
Of course, yes. Ted Morton is the Vice President of Fairness Alberta. Ted, thank you so much for being with us today.
I hope we shed some light on a murky subject. Thank you.
We
But
sure
a murky
did.
but important, a murky subject, but an important subject.
John Diefenbaker was Canada's 13th Prime Minister, and he was at times controversial, eccentric, but someone who seemed to be able to identify with regular Canadian folks. Are there some things that today's leaders could learn from him? Today's guest thinks so. Bob Plamondon joins us today. He is a public policy expert, an economist and consultant, and a best-selling author. His latest book is Freedom Fighter, John Diefenbaker's Battle for Canadian Liberties and Independence. Great to have you with us, Bob.
Pleasure to be with you.
So, John Diefenbaker, can you just share a bit about his background, who he was, where, and how he was raised?
So he was born in Ontario, small town Ontario. His family moved to Saskatchewan when he was about 8 years old. And he grew up in poverty with a Germanic surname when there were a lot of challenges around having a Germanic surname at that time. You know, certainly politically when Canada had been at world war with Germany. He did enlist in the war. But he always had a fascination with world history and Canadian history. And I always identified with the underdog. And I think that's what brought him into the practice of law. So he had a small law firm in Saskatchewan and also got involved in politics. But the two combined somewhat in that he identified with the underdog. He took on cases that others wouldn't. He represented Indigenous Canadians. He represented Francophones in the West when, you know, that wasn't very popular. So he had this bit of a rebel streak, but certainly a very accomplished lawyer. His interest in politics gave him certainly some persistence. He ran in 5 federal and provincial elections and went 0 for 5 before finally winning in 1940, so at the outset of World War I. And still coming into Parliament, again, he is neither English or French in heritage, which is, you know, one of the very few at that point in time. And, you know, again, was always concerned about the rights of individual Canadians because he felt himself to be something of a minority, not coming from the mainstream. And he didn't go to an elite educational institute. You know, he wasn't friends with the powerful and the mighty. He was always an outsider, but identified with ordinary Canadians. So he finds himself as a member of the Progressive Conservative Party in 1940. They're in opposition. And then he ultimately runs once, then twice for leader of the party and got obliterated, but ultimately won in 1956, not the leadership of his party, not because the power brokers and the elites in the party thought, you know, he would be a good leader. It's because he had developed a great relationship with the grassroots of the party. He was a great orator, public speaker, man of charisma. And again, he could connect with them in ways that the more establishment figures could not. And even in the party at the time, the power brokers didn't want him. They thought he'd win the leadership and then get defeated in an election. So anyway, I'm bringing you up to the point where he runs for Prime Minister in 1957.
Right, and I think it shows a lot of perseverance that he ran for public office 5 times and lost before finally winning on his 6th attempt. Now, he's also described as a prairie populist. What does that mean?
Well, prairie, obviously, because, you know, that's where his home base was. Populist in the sense that he didn't come into politics with a fixed set of ideas. He wasn't ideological. You couldn't describe him as the traditional conservative at the time, which came out of Bay Street, pro-business. He was someone who, I think his firm fixed ideas was an attachment to the monarchy and the British tradition. That was at his core. And an independent Canada, meaning independent from the United States, could stand on its own 2 feet. And he certainly was anti-communist. But other than that, he would look at a problem, he would consult widely, he talked to colleagues, he talked to Canadians, and he was a problem solver at heart. And at his core, he was always looking to help the poor, helping those who were disadvantaged, looking to help those who, through no fault of their own, found themselves in a struggle. Those are the people that he wanted to help.
So let's bring John Diefenbaker into 2025, and he's the Prime Minister. Canadians have been very concerned about U.S. intrusions into Canadian affairs in light of Trump's tariff war. So you write that Diefenbaker was always wary of American influence over Canada. So how do you think he would be responding to our current situation now in 2025?
So within months of becoming Prime Minister in 1957 in a minority parliament, the very first thing he did was to announce a policy to divert 15% of Canadian trade away from the United States and towards Commonwealth countries and other countries around the world. So he was trying to build up the resilience of the Canadian economy. The other thing that he did was, as Macdonald had a national vision, Diefenbaker had a northern vision. So he was developing the infrastructure of roads to resources and rail lines to the north of Canada to develop our energy, our minerals, our forestry. And he was doing that not just to build up our economy, but to Canadianize it in a sense that a lot of our resource industry and other industries had been foreign held. So coming to 2025, we look at the threats that exist south of the border. And certainly when I started writing my book, I wasn't thinking that there'd be a belligerent American president who was trying to overtake Canada and threaten our sovereignty. But Diefenbaker, from the get-go, was trying to assert independence. And so, he would be quite comfortable, I think, with his core values leading Canada in 2025, because he had been talking about Canadian independence his entire life. This would have been core to his being, and he would invest. He was criticized when he was Prime Minister because he ran deficits. He ran deficits because he was investing in our national infrastructure. So these were things to strengthen our economy and strengthen our resilience and our independence.
I'd really love to see a meeting between John Diefenbaker and U.S. President Donald Trump. I think that would be a very interesting encounter. Now, you had also talked about how...
it would be raucous, for sure, because Diefenbaker if he had an enemy, it was John F. Kennedy. They battled, throughout the term that they were together. And Diefenbaker didn't hesitate to take on Kennedy, and he certainly wouldn't have hesitated to take on Trump.
There will be some fireworks at that meeting, that's for sure. Now, you described John Diefenbaker as being very popular and appealing to just the average person, but he was often also labeled as being a bit of an oddball and an eccentric madman. How much truth was there to this?
Well, he was thought of as a madman and somewhat paranoid. The paranoia part was he didn't take well to anyone who questions his leadership, and he wasn't someone who even went to caucus, and his connection with ordinary Canadians, not within the elite. So the people who were calling him erratic were the ones who had always had the ear of the government, and they certainly, with John Diefenbaker, didn't have the ear. But he did things that were certainly courageous, and I think he's on the right side of history. But standing up to the Americans was not a popular thing to do. One issue was the cancellation of the Avro Aero fighter aircraft, where it was the right decision, but it was not particularly popular at the time. there was this hope that Canada would have developed this aircraft that the world would want. Well, the world didn't want the aircraft, and it didn't respond to the military threat at the time, and the military didn't want it, and the previous Liberal government didn't want it, the bureaucrats didn't want it, but only Diefenbaker had the courage to cancel it. He was also criticized for effectively sacking the governor of the Bank of Canada, James Coyne. So, that got him a lot of attention. That's not something that the financial community was necessarily keen on its own, but the governor of the Bank of Canada had become quite erratic and was doing quite a bit of damage to our economy. And so he took on Coyne. And so these things got, a lot of attention and somewhat took on a life of their own, certainly mythologized. And the media didn't like John Diefenbaker, so they were, quick to attack him. And that kind of set in the minds of Canadians this notion that Diefenbaker was a bit erratic. The other thing was not accepting American-controlled nuclear weapons on Canadian soil during the Cold War crisis, certainly the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that was the nature of the battle he had with the Kennedy administration. But if you look today, the policies he set forth on the relationship with the Bank of Canada, between the government and the Bank of Canada, that if they disagree, that the governor has to resign. And there were American nuclear weapons on Canadian soil, but for a very short period of time that Pearson allowed. And the policy that Diefenbaker had, that he was criticized at the time for being erratic, has been the policy of the Canadian government for the last 60 years.
Wow, so you're talking about all these gutsy moves that Diefenbaker made, but Diefenbaker was also against government heavy-handedness. He opposed the use of the War Measures Act. What do you think he would have said to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's use of the Emergencies Act, which is a War Measures Act?
Well, it's the War Measures Act, which Pierre Trudeau invoked during the October crisis, was ultimately replaced with the Emergencies Act. So there were checks and balances put on that act. And I think Diefenbaker would have supported the legislation of the Emergencies Act because he was always afraid that the War Measures Act would be used in times of peace against the people. So, for example, when the Premier of Newfoundland wanted the RCMP to come in and break up a strike, where there had been some violence on the picket line, Diefenbaker said, I'm not going to turn, the military or the army or the National Police Force against striking workers. He certainly opposed the internment of the Japanese during World War II. So he was always very protective of individual rights, but he didn't think that, during a real time of war or insurrection, that the government should just simply, be indifferent to it, that it would need the heavy hand of government. Whether he would have invoked the Emergencies Act against the convoy protesters is hard to say at this point in time, but he certainly would have thought of it as a last resort.
And I understand that it was Diefenbaker who gave Indigenous Canadians the right to vote. How controversial was this at that time?
So it was controversial in that the Liberal governments, and they had been Liberal governments, for much of Diefenbaker's lives. The 9 previous elections before Diefenbaker became Prime Minister were all won by Liberals. And so he had made this proposal. The Liberals had always said, yes, we could give Indigenous people the right to vote, but they had to give up all their rights, all their treaty rights. They had to effectively become the same and equal status as every other Canadian. And Diefenbaker said no. He said, you can have the right to vote and retain all of your treaty rights. You are the first people, who populated this land, and you shouldn't have to surrender it. It wasn't something that the Indigenous communities were particularly advocating for at the time, but Diefenbaker thought, as he criticized South Africa and the apartheid system, we couldn't really have a system in Canada where they didn't have the right to vote. He not only gave them the right to vote, he appointed the first parliamentarian, James Gladstone, to the Senate of Canada. And so that was controversial in the sense that I think throughout Canadian society, and certainly in the Liberal Party, did not think that the community was ready for these steps and measures, and it was Diefenbaker's leadership that made it happen.
So we're almost out of time, but there's a couple more questions I really want to squeeze in here. Albertans are feeling snubbed by Central Canada. So how do you feel Diefenbaker would respond to the threat of Alberta separation?
So, Western alienation has existed throughout Canadian history to some degree or another. We've seen it somewhat through social credit, through the Reform Party, which I think was its follow-on. Diefenbaker always had a national vision. He thought the only way that Canada can exist as a country, as unlikely a country as we are, is if we are united. So he would certainly be a supporter of developing our resources, which is one of the reasons why the West, feels so isolated at the time. But he would have put all of his energies into keeping Canada united, and for Western Canadians to ensure that they had a voice at the table, and that all the decisions that that affected the West were not being made by Central Canada.
And lastly, what could Prime Minister Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre learn from John Diefenbaker?
Well, I think it's something that Jean Chrétien says all the time: trust the people. The people are smart, they're wise, they're reasonable. Maintain your connection with and represent the needs of ordinary Canadians, and be just. The rich don't need an advocate, powerful don't need an advocate, bankers don't need an advocate, but individual Canadians do. And I think that would be the message he would give to politicians since the time he left office.
Bob Plamondon is the author of freedom fighter John Diefenbaker's Battle for Canadian Liberties and Independence. Bob, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
I'm Naveen Day. On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, thanks for watching.